Hello there. 2 years ago, there were mass protests in Belarus against ruler Lukashenko. The trade unions are now held responsible for this. The authoritarian Republic of Belarus has now also banned the work of independent trade unions. Almost 2 years after the mass protests against the ruler Alexander Lukashenko, the judicial authorities based their decision on alleged extremist activities by several union leaders and even members. The trade unions had taken part in an escalation of the situation. The Prosecutor General's office said this on Tuesday in Minsk, citing a decision by the country's Supreme Court. After the controversial presidential election on August 9th in 2020, Lukashenko had himself declared the winner again. This led to mass protests, which were brutally put down by the security forces. Several demonstrators died, hundreds were injured, and thousands were imprisoned. The authorities gave the unions some responsibility for the situation. At the time, the unions had also called for strikes in state-owned companies in order to paralyze Lukashenko's power base. For example, the Free Union of Metal Workers, the unions for employees in the mining, chemical, and construction industries, among others, and the umbrella organization Belarusian Congress of Democratic Unions have now been banned. According to the Attorney General's office, criminal proceedings against trade unionists for participation in destructive acts are still pending. The unions were also accused of receiving help from abroad for their anti-state work. The authorities had previously banned numerous human rights and non-governmental organizations in Belarus because Lukashenko, who is considered Europe's last dictator, also blamed them for the mass protests. Belarus is also closely aligned with the Kremlin and in the Ukraine war. Although Lukashenko has so far shied away from sending his own troops to the country, Putin has his own plans for the dictator. We support fraternal Russia and will continue to do so. If anyone still had doubts about where Belarus stands in the Ukraine war, Alexander Lukashenko has just enlightened them. On the National Independence Day on July 3rd of all days, the Belarusian dictator reaffirmed his loyalty to Vladimir Putin and even spoke of a united army with Russia. And that's a public submission. Although officially staying out of the war, Ukraine's neighbor has been deeply involved since the Russian invasion began. Belarus not only assures the Russians of logistical support, but has had its troops trained in the immediate vicinity of the border with Ukraine for months. Many Ukrainians therefore fear that Lukashenko could soon formally enter the war and invade northern Ukraine. But how real is this danger? Ukraine's border with Belarus is over 1,000 kilometers long. For comparison, here in Germany, the German border with France is around 450 kilometers long and is therefore difficult to secure. The Belarusian. Due to its geography and proximity to Kiev, the capital is only just 150 kilometers from Belarus. Belarus offers the perfect starting point for an attack on northern Ukraine. In February, this advantage was already being exploited. Russian troops, officially in Belarus for training purposes, crossed the Ukrainian border and advanced on Kiev and the Chernihiv regions. What followed was a month of terror. Those who fell under Russian occupation experienced mass murder, torture, and bombing. It was only thanks to fierce Ukrainian resistance that the Russian army had to withdraw at the end of March and relocated its forces to the east. Despite the withdrawal of the Russians, shelling and acts of sabotage continue in northern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military leadership is therefore forced to leave forces and material there in order to prepare for worse. For Ukrainian military expert Oleg Zdanov, that is exactly the purpose of the provocations from Belarus. It ties up Ukrainian troops that are needed in Donbas and the south. The reserve colonel is not currently expecting a comprehensive invasion by Belarusian troops, but rather further smaller attacks from Belarusian territory. According to Zdanov, the Kremlin has assigned Lukashenko a clear role: to threaten a second front in the north and thereby keep as many Ukrainian troops as possible there. But there could also be a second, more ambitious goal, according to Zdanov. Belarus could try to cut off the supply route for Western weapons at the Polish border. However, the military analyst cautions that complex operations like this require significant resources. And resources, whether financial or military, are finite in Belarus and not infinite. According to experts, Belarus could currently send no more than 18,000 soldiers, far too few for an assault on Kiev. In addition, Lukashenko's troops would have to reckon with fierce resistance from the battle-hardened Ukrainian units, which successfully drove off the Russians months ago. Putin's disaster at the Battle of Kiev was closely watched in Belarus. The spokesman for the Ukrainian border guard, Andriy Denchenko, confirmed on request that Ukrainian troops have reinforced the entire border with Belarus. While there is currently no evidence that Belarusian forces are preparing to invade northern Ukraine, a surprise attack cannot be ruled out. That's what Denchenko told the German newscaster T-Online. However, despite bold declarations that he will support Russia wherever he can, the Belarusian leader is in no hurry to engage his army in active hostilities. From the point of view of the Belarusian journalist Iya Ilyash from the Belsat TV channel, there is one reason above all: the negative attitude in Belarusian society. Despite the widespread sympathy for Russia, only around 11% of the population are currently in favor of entering the war against Ukraine, says Ilyash to T-Online. Active participation in the war could also provoke new mass protests. A real danger in the authoritarian country, because in 2020 protests against the rigged presidential election almost plunged the regime into the abyss. Lukashenko got off with a black eye, with Russia's help, of course, but the dictator is aware of the risk of protests flaring up again. The mere fact that Belarus allows Russia to use its territory to attack Ukraine has led to a certain resistance movement. Since the beginning of the war, the country has experienced a wave of acts of sabotage of the railway network. The presumed goal behind it is to hinder the transport of Russian military equipment. More than 80 such disruptive actions are known, says the journalist Ilyash. The lack of social support for Ukraine mission would also weaken the morale of the Belarusian army. That's what Ilyash believes. But one thing is clear: neither Lukashenko nor Putin wants an unstable Belarus. The Kremlin could lose its only wartime ally. This is also the argument that Lukashenko can successfully use in negotiations with Putin to avoid being drawn even further into the war. But the situation can change quickly. The risk of participating in the war depends on how successful the Russian army is, and that's what Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba recently pointed out. The Belarusian journalist Ilyash also believes this is possible. If Lukashenko sees that the Ukrainian army is being further weakened and his participation does not require too much effort, then he will participate. It is no coincidence that Lukashenko's latest threats against Kiev came at a time after Russia had captured the strategically important cities of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk. However, an attack from Belarus can only be carried out jointly by Belarusian and Russian forces. Moscow is already moving more troops to the neighboring country. The Ukrainian General Staff said that Russian Iskander-M missile systems and S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems were recently deployed near the Belarusian city of Gomel, near the Ukrainian border. The presence of Russian fighter jets in the region has also increased. The number of troops for another invasion is too small, though, but that may change soon. There is no doubt that Belarus is an accomplice in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The country has offered Moscow its territory as a springboard for an invasion and has allowed missile and airstrikes on Ukrainian cities. The image of the peacemaker that Lukashenko has been trying to build since 2015 by offering to mediate in the Donbas conflict has been completely destroyed. The dictator is now forced to weigh up the pressure from Moscow against the fragility of his own power. But even if he continues to avoid active involvement in Putin's war, he has long been part of it, and he has blood on his hands. And we will never forget that. And I'll see you in my next video. Schau vorbei.